My name is Carver Clark Gayton. I was born and raised here in Seattle. I was fortunate to be a part of a pretty large family here in Seattle that's been here quite some time. My paternal grandfather was a fellow by the name of John T. Gayton, John Thomas Gayton. They called him JT for short. And he came here in 1889, right before we became a state. So he came up from Benton County, Mississippi. And so our family has been here, ever since. My father is the oldest son of J.T. Gayton. He was born here in 1899 and was the first child baptized at the First AME Church here in Seattle. And my mother was actually conceived in Spokane and was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1902. The reason why she was born in Tennessee was because her mother wanted her to, be there so that they could, she could look after the baby, look after her for those first few months. And so she came back to Spokane just a few months later, and so she was raised in Spokane and graduated from Lewis and Clark High School. My mother and father met in about 1925. She had graduated from Lewis and Clark High School, as I mentioned, but went away to Howard University in 1920 after she graduated from high school. And at that time she was living, after she graduated, her family went to Spokane to live because her father, Cyrus Clark, was born as a result of his father escaping from slavery. And he was born in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, so they have a Canada connection. And my mother's family was raised part of her life in Vancouver, British Columbia. But from Vancouver, British Columbia, that's when she went to Howard, and then came back to Seattle to work because the jobs weren't too readily available. But she came here to Seattle, met my dad, and so there's a family that came about, born from the 1920s through the 1940s. They had 8 children in the family, and I think I'm the sixth child in the family, and went all the way through school here, from Madrona Grade School, the Meany Junior High to Garfield, and then on to the University of Washington.
All right, so you grew up in the central area, Seattle Central area.
Yes, I was born on the corner of Pike and 32nd Avenue. And my family, when they moved up here in 1938, my mother was carrying me. But we were the first family to kind of come out of the valley there, the Madison Valley of black family. And so, as I understand it, there was a lot of challenges from the white community there when that first black family, our family, moved up there. And so they were called the N-word, and rocks were thrown at the house and all that sort of business. But it's interesting seeing the transitions years later. When I was at Garfield, for example, about half of that area had become black, and in the late 60s it became, probably close to about 80% black. And now it's kind of gone back to the same mix of black and white as it was when I was at Garfield High School in the 1950s.
And you went on to the University of Washington?
Yes, I went on to the University of Washington. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do coming out of Garfield, but there was a fellow by the name of Darrell Royal, who was a famous football coach at the University of Texas over the years, but at that time he was the coach at the University of Washington, and I was fortunate to be a part of a very successful team at Garfield. We were the city champions 2 years in a row, and went to what we called the Turkey Day game each one of those years, my junior and senior years, and those were basically the state championships. And so I was part of 2 nominal state championship teams, and because of that, Darrell Royal recruited me, thought I was a pretty good ball player, and so he said, if you keep putting out the effort that you did like you were in high school, you'll be able to maintain a scholarship all the way through the University of Washington. Well, he only stayed at the University of Washington and went to Texas only 1 year, And then I went on and played under Jim Owens and was part of the first Rose Bowl team, University of Washington Rose Bowl team, to win a Rose Bowl. And then that was in 1960, and the 61 Rose Bowl, which we also won. I was the graduate assistant coach, and that team became a national championship team, one of only 2 national championship football teams that the University of Washington have ever had.
That's amazing. So you've gone on, you're very active in the community here in Seattle, but you just recently wrote a book. So
yes, I wrote a book that was an introduction to a narrative that my great-grandfather, Lewis G. Clark, wrote. My mother's grandfather dictated to a gentleman. His name was, he lived in the home of a fellow by the name of Aaron Safford. But the fellow he dictated to was a Reverend Lovejoy. He was the head of the Congregational Church in Cambridge. He escaped from slavery from Kentucky and went to Cambridge, Massachusetts, because they heard of his adventures, pretty much, escaping from slavery from Lexington and going up to Canada, and then back to, then into Ohio, and then from Ohio to Cambridge. But it's a fascinating story, and when he was in Cambridge, he dictated his story to this Reverend Lovejoy. And that took a number of years, but at the same time, he was talking to a woman by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who heard of his story and was coming by the home of Aaron and Mary Safford. Mary Safford was the sister-in-law of Harriet Beecher Stowe. The abolitionists arranged for him to live in that home while he was in Cambridge, and so he was dictating his story to this pastor on one end, but then also Harriet Beecher Stowe was taking copious notes about her life at the same time. And so it's interesting to note in relation to his story is that if you look at the primary characters of Uncle Tom's Cabin and then the general storyline, my great-grandfather's story is pretty much if not the essence, at least is a very strong direction of that book. And she wrote a book, Harriet Beecher Stowe, after her book came out in 1852. People didn't believe all these stories, much of which related to what my great-grandfather experienced as a slave. And so she felt as though she had to write a book that would show the true characters that her novel was based upon, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so in that book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, George Harris, who's one of the primary characters in the book, he was the rebellious quadroon within that book, and did not go along with the slavery system and wanted to get out of it. That's why he escaped from slavery. He did exactly the same thing that my grandfather did. So that's the basis. That was the basis of the story. So interestingly, I found out about this story. Our family did way back from the time I was about 4 years old, and my mother would pull out this plum-colored book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and in that book it had George Harris. It was Lewis G. Clark was the primary character that character was based upon, his life, and she also quoted long excerpts from the narrative that had come out in 1845. I should say, with regard to that narrative, the short title is the narrative of the sufferings of Lewis Clark. It's a real long title, but that book was placed in the Library of Congress, the United States Library of Congress, and it was the first book from a fugitive slave that was placed in copyright in the U.S. Library of Congress. And on another note, he was the first fugitive slave to speak out against slavery in a public setting, which started in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the 1840s, and he had a whole series of speaking engagements throughout that area. he didn't know how to learn. He didn't know anything about reading or writing until he sat down with Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister-in-law, who taught him how to read and write.
See, that's such an amazing connection. And then for you to be able to pick up these pieces and then present them again and have them available for people to read
Right.
and then connect with on our level.
Well, the great thing I was able to do was a year ago this month, I had a reissue of that slave narrative, and I wrote a in-depth introduction, and so that book was published by the University of Washington Press back in September of last year, and so that book is available, but I'm writing a sequel to that book because it only goes up to the 1845 when he was a young man. He was born in 1850. And so this follow-up book takes his life all the way from 1845 to when he died in 1897 in Lexington, Kentucky. But the interesting thing is, my mother would tell us these stories and pull out that book and say, here's somebody who was a member of our family. In fact, it was my grandfather. She never met him because he died 4 years before she was born. And so we just thought it was interesting family lore, not anything that was really of national interest. And so as a result, but I found out as the years went by, just to make a long story short, that he was very famous during those years as a black abolitionist speaking on behalf of Abolitionist Society and the Anti-Slavery Society back in those days. But I didn't learn all this until recent years, but we kind of kept that just within the family. But now it's open to everybody.
See, and that's what we're doing here today with these stories. So we thank you for stopping by, Carver.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I tell you, I really enjoy all that you're doing for the Northwest African American Museum and for the Jimi Hendrix Park, and just my pleasure to be part of this venture.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.